The 2nd Guards Battalion faltered, their scarlet line buckling under a tide of Maryland and Delaware Continentals surging forward with bayonets lowered. British officers screamed for the men to hold, but the exhausted redcoats could not reset their ranks fast enough. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara spurred his horse into the gap, rallying the Grenadier Company with his sword raised high. A musket ball slammed into his chest, and he pitched from the saddle, disappearing under the boots of his own retreating guardsmen. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis watched from the rear as the cream of his army came apart in the clearing. He had one option left. Cornwallis turned to Lieutenant John McLeod and gave the order that no British commander ever wanted to give. McLeod's 6-pounder was loaded with grape shot, a cylinder packed with iron balls designed to shred infantry at close range. The gun was aimed directly at the tangled mass of British and American soldiers struggling in the open field. McLeod touched the match, and the cannon erupted. The blast tore through friend and foe without discrimination, a horizontal storm of iron that dropped men in heaps across the grass. British Guards and Maryland Continentals fell together, their blood pooling in the same North Carolina soil. The American counterattack, moments from shattering Cornwallis's entire line, stopped cold. Major General Nathanael Greene watched from the Continental position and made an instantaneous calculation. He could press the attack and risk losing the only reliable regulars he possessed, or he could pull them back and preserve the army for another fight. Greene ordered the withdrawal. The 1st Maryland and the Delaware Light Infantry disengaged in good order, stepping backward through the smoke with their wounded slung over their shoulders. Colonel John Gunby kept his regiment in formation as they retreated, a wall of blue-coated veterans refusing to turn their backs on the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard's Delaware men covered the withdrawal, their bayonets still slick from the countercharge. The Continentals left the field, their 2 6-pounders and the dead to the British. Cornwallis held the ground, but the ground was carpeted with his own soldiers. 93 British dead lay among the trees and across the plateau, their bodies mixed with the American fallen the grape shot had cut down. 413 wounded redcoats and Hessians waited for surgeons who would work through the night without pause. The Brigade of Guards alone lost 11 officers and 200 men, a casualty rate that rendered the unit combat ineffective. Nearly 28% of Cornwallis's entire army had been killed or wounded in under 2 hours of fighting. When Cornwallis sat down to write his dispatch to Lord George Germain in London, he declared a complete victory. He did not mention that his guards had broken and run. He wrote nothing of the Marylanders driving British regulars backward at bayonet point. He omitted the order to fire grape shot into his own men. The official account buried the desperate truth of the plateau beneath the language of triumph. American wounded left on the field when Greene pulled back lay in the cold for hours before British burial parties reached them. The dead and dying sprawled across the New Garden Road, their uniforms no longer marking them as friend or enemy. Guardsmen who minutes earlier had been among the most elite soldiers in the British Empire now shared shallow graves with the colonial farmers they had mocked. Cornwallis had won the field, but he had lost the campaign. Within days he would abandon the Carolinas entirely, his crippled army shuffling toward the coast, and eventually to the siege at Yorktown. Greene's Continentals marched away intact, bloodied but unbroken, having proven they could stand toe-to-toe with the best infantry the Crown could send against them. The British public would not learn the truth of Guilford Courthouse until long after the war was lost. Parliament heard only of a hard-fought victory in the Carolina backcountry, another step toward crushing the rebellion. The men who survived the grape shot knew better. They carried the memory of that cannon blast for the rest of their lives. The sound of British iron tearing through British flesh on the orders of a desperate general who had no other move left to make. The men who survived the grape shot carried that memory, but the road to that desperate moment had been paved weeks earlier in the mud and pine barrens of the Carolinas. Major General Nathanael Greene had taken command of the Southern Department in December of 1780, inheriting an army that existed mostly on paper. His predecessor, General Horatio Gates, had lost the Battle of Camden in August, a disaster that scattered the Southern Continental force and left barely 800 effectives under arms. Greene arrived at Charlotte, North Carolina on December 2nd and found a skeletal command rotting from neglect. The commissary department was non-existent. Soldiers scavenged for their own meals, roaming the countryside in small bands to beg or steal food from the local population. Clothing had rotted off men's backs during the wet autumn marches. Shoes had disintegrated weeks earlier, and hundreds of men walked barefoot through freezing mud and pine needles. Disease swept through the camps unchecked. Dysentery and typhus claimed more lives than British musket balls had during the entire preceding campaign season. Greene wrote to the Continental Congress that his army was in a wretched condition, underfed, underclothed, and reduced to the verge of dissolution. But Greene was not a man who waited for Congress to solve his problems. Born a Quaker in Rhode Island, with no formal military training beyond what he had taught himself from books in his own library, Greene possessed an instinct for logistics and maneuver that most of his contemporaries lacked. He looked at the Southern campaign and understood something fundamental. Cornwallis had superior numbers of trained regulars, superior cavalry, and momentum. Fighting him head-on with the force Greene currently possessed would be suicide. So Greene decided not to fight, at least not yet. He split his tiny army. The decision defied every convention of 18th century warfare, which dictated that a weaker force should concentrate to avoid defeat in detail. Greene broke approximately 2,200 men into two columns. He sent Brigadier General Daniel Morgan west with roughly 600 troops, including the Maryland and Delaware Continentals and some Virginia riflemen, to threaten British outposts and rally support in the backcountry. Greene himself marched east with the remainder, around 1,100 men, toward the PD River in South Carolina. The plan was to force Cornwallis into an impossible choice. If the British general pursued Morgan, Greene could strike at British supply lines and isolated garrisons in the eastern part of the state. If Cornwallis turned on Greene, Morgan's force would roam freely through the western settlements, gathering militia and cutting British communications. Cornwallis, unwilling to leave either column unchecked, divided his own force. He dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton with his British Legion to hunt down Morgan, a decision that would lead directly to the disaster at Cowpens in January 1781. Meanwhile, Cornwallis himself pursued Greene through the eastern Carolinas, but Greene did not give battle. He marched his men constantly, always staying just ahead of the British advance, never stopping long enough for Cornwallis to force a decisive engagement. The Continentals called it the Race to the Dan. Greene drove his soldiers across North Carolina at a punishing pace, through freezing rain and sleet, over rutted roads that churned into bogs under the weight of wagons and artillery. Many of the men were barefoot, their feet wrapped in rags that offered almost no protection against the frozen ground. At night they slept in the open without tents, huddled around small fires that the wind scattered before dawn. Rations dropped to a handful of parched corn per man per day. Some soldiers subsisted on acorns and whatever small game they could catch in the woods. Disease continued its work. Men collapsed on the march from exhaustion and fever, and those who could not be carried were left with local families who might or might not have the means to care for them. But the army did not break. Greene moved among the men every night, dismounting from his horse to walk with the rear guard, speaking to soldiers by name, sharing what little food the commissary could scrape together. The soldiers called him the Fighting Quaker, though he had long since been expelled from his meeting for his military service. Cornwallis chased him relentlessly. The British general had defeated the Americans at Charleston and Camden twice, and he expected to do it again whenever he could close the distance. Cornwallis's troops were also suffering, their supply wagons bogged in the same Carolina mud. But they had a critical advantage. They had won every major engagement in the South for the past year, and they marched with the confidence of repeated victory. The British regulars had faced militia at Camden and watched them shatter. They had faced Continentals at Charleston and accepted their surrender. They believed, with good reason, that no American army could stand against them in open battle. This belief was exactly what Greene intended to exploit. By the time he reached the Dan River on the Virginia border in mid-February, Greene had marched his army over 200 miles in 3 weeks. He crossed the river ahead of Cornwallis, denied the British general his decisive battle, and began receiving reinforcements from Virginia. Fresh militia and new Continental recruits filtered into camp, men who had not yet endured the brutal march but would soon be tested by fire. Morgan rejoined Greene in early March after his stunning victory at Cowpens, and the combined American force swelled to over 4,000 men. Greene now had the numbers to fight, but he remained cautious. He needed ground that would maximize the advantages of his citizen soldiers and blunt the British superiority in cavalry and bayonet drill. He chose a site near Guilford Courthouse, a small settlement in the Carolina backcountry where the New Garden Road cut through rolling woodland. The position offered exactly what Greene wanted. Open fields on the plateau would give his artillery clear lines of fire and prevent Cornwallis from flanking his regulars unseen. Heavy woods in front of the plateau would break up British formations as they advanced, stripping the redcoats of the cohesion that made their volleys so devastating. A rail fence bordering the first field would give militia something solid to stand behind, a psychological anchor for men who had never faced British bayonets. Greene studied the terrain for 3 days, walking its contours on foot, noting every rise and hollow that might shelter an attacker or screen a defender. He organized his 4,400 men into the 3 lines that would define the battle, each position roughly 300 to 400 yards behind the one in front. The deployment was not random. Each line was designed to extract a specific cost from the advancing British columns, to bleed momentum as well as blood. Cornwallis, for his part, welcomed the opportunity to fight at last. His roughly 1,900 troops had been chasing Greene across the Carolinas for nearly 2 months, and their supplies were running low. On the night of March 14th, the British camped along the New Garden Road, about 12 miles from Guilford Courthouse. The men were exhausted and hungry, but their officers assured them the Americans would run as they always had. Cornwallis expected to smash Greene's army, reclaim North Carolina for the crown, and march north to link up with British forces in Virginia. The stage was set on ground of Greene's choosing. At dawn on March 15th, the British drums began to beat. Greene had spent 3 days walking the ground around Guilford Courthouse. He knew every fold in the terrain, every patch of undergrowth, every slope that might conceal or expose a formation. The position stretched along the New Garden Road, where it ran west through rolling farmland and patches of dense second-growth forest. A rail fence bordered the first cleared field, rough-hewn split logs that separated the road from a stretch of recently harvested corn stubble. Behind this fence, Greene placed his first line. Roughly 1,000 North Carolina militiamen under Brigadier General John Butler and Brigadier General Thomas Eaton shuffled into position in the gray pre-dawn cold of March 15th. Many of these men had never fired their muskets in combat. They came from farms and small settlements across the Carolina backcountry, summoned by emergency levies that Greene had issued as his army moved north. Their clothing was civilian, homespun coats patched with whatever fabric their wives could spare, broad-brimmed hats, leather breeches worn thin at the knees. Some carried hunting rifles rather than military muskets, weapons accurate at distance but slow to reload. They stamped their feet against the morning chill and glanced nervously at the empty road stretching east toward the British camp. Greene rode along the fence line personally, his plain coat and round hat making him almost indistinguishable from his staff. He did not give them a rousing speech. He gave them specific instructions. Fire 2 volleys when the British came within range, then fall back through the second line and reassemble in the rear. He told them they had done everything asked of them already by simply standing here. Forward of the fence, Greene deployed a screen of skirmishers. Lee's Legion infantry and a company of Virginia riflemen spread out along the road and into the woods on either flank, roughly 150 yards ahead of the militia line. These were Greene's best light troops, veterans who had fought under Henry Lee in dozens of running engagements across the Carolinas. Their job was to sting the British advance, pick off officers if they could, and then melt back through the first line before the main collision. The riflemen checked their powder horns and settled behind whatever cover they could find: a fallen log, a low stone outcropping, a depression in the frozen earth. 300 yards behind the North Carolina militia, the ground rose into a belt of heavy woods. This was where Greene placed his second line, roughly 1,200 Virginia militiamen under Brigadier General Edward Stevens and Brigadier General Robert Lawson. The trees here grew thick and close, oak and hickory interspersed with dense underbrush that had not been cleared in living memory. Sunlight filtered through the bare March branches in pale gray shafts, illuminating patches of dead leaves and the occasional glint of a musket barrel. Stevens had been with Greene since the retreat from the Dan, and he understood what was being asked of his men. The Virginia militia were better equipped than the North Carolinians, and many had seen action before, but they were still citizen soldiers, not regulars. Greene positioned them in the woods precisely because the terrain would prevent the British from using their preferred linear assault. Redcoats advancing through tangled undergrowth would lose formation, lose sight of their officers, and emerge in scattered clumps rather than disciplined lines. Stevens walked among his regiments, a tall man with a voice that carried through the trees, repeating the same instructions Greene had given the first line. Hold as long as you can. Make every shot count. Then fall back in order to the third line. 300 yards further up the slope, the woods ended. The ground opened onto a broad plateau of pasture land and scattered farm plots that commanded a clear view in every direction. Here, on the highest ground available, Greene placed his third and final line. Roughly 1,400 Continental regulars formed along the plateau astride the New Garden Road. These were the soldiers who had survived the winter march from the Dan, the men who had eaten acorns and wrapped their feet in rags, and kept moving because there was no alternative. The 1st Maryland Regiment under Colonel John Gunby anchored the right of the line. The 2nd Maryland Regiment held the center. The Delaware Light Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard took position on the left, joined by the 4th Virginia Regiment. These men carried standard-issue French muskets and bayonets, and they knew how to use both. They had trained under officers who drilled them relentlessly during every halt in the retreat, running them through loading sequences and bayonet thrusts until the movements became automatic. Their uniforms were still ragged, their faces still gaunt from months of privation, but they stood in ranks with the quiet steadiness of men who had already endured the worst the war could throw at them. Between the Maryland and Delaware regiments, Greene positioned his two remaining 6-pounder field guns. The bronze barrels gleamed faintly in the strengthening morning light, their crews standing ready with rammers and powder charges. These guns were positioned to command the road and the open fields on either flank, giving the Continentals a field of fire that stretched for several hundred yards. No American could see what was happening on the New Garden Road east of the plateau, but every man on that hilltop could hear it. The British drums had been beating since dawn, and now the sound of heavy wheels and marching feet carried clearly through the cold air. Cornwallis had formed his roughly 1,900 troops into columns along the road and was advancing toward the American position at a steady pace. The British order of march reflected the professional hierarchy of an army that had won every major engagement in the South. Leading the advance were the Brigade of Guards, the elite of Cornwallis's infantry, fresh from their hard service at Camden the previous year. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara commanded these men, the 1st and 2nd Guards battalions, soldiers selected from the best regiments in the British Army. Behind the Guards came the line regiments, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the 33rd Foot, and the 71st Highlanders, Fraser's regiment of kilted Scots, who had earned a fearsome reputation among the colonists. The Hessian von Bow's regiment marched with them, German mercenaries in blue coats whose discipline under fire was legendary on the European continent. Tarleton's British Legion dragoons brought up the flanks, light cavalrymen armed with sabers and short carbines, watching for any opportunity to sweep around the American line. Cornwallis also brought his artillery, several light 3-pounder cannons and a single 6-pounder, smaller than the American guns but more maneuverable on the narrow woodland road. The British column stretched for nearly half a mile along the New Garden Road, a serpent of scarlet and blue winding through the brown winter fields. Cornwallis could see the American skirmishers ahead through his field glass, small dark figures crouched along the fence and among the trees. He knew Greene had chosen this ground for a reason, but the exact disposition of the American lines remained hidden by the folds of the terrain. His scouts had reported 3 distinct positions, but the heavy woods obscured everything beyond the first fence line. Cornwallis decided to open with his guns. The British 3-pounders were unlimbered roughly 400 yards from the American skirmish line, their crews working quickly to level the small bronze tubes on their wooden carriages. The single 6-pounder rolled forward behind them, heavier and slower, but capable of throwing a solid iron ball much farther than the lighter pieces. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, the first British cannon fired. The report echoed across the frozen fields like a thunderclap, scattering birds from the treetops and sending a plume of gray smoke rolling across the road. The iron ball screamed over the skirmishers' heads and buried itself in the field behind the rail fence, throwing up a spray of frozen dirt. More guns fired in quick succession, the 3-pounders and the 6-pounder working together to find the range. The American 6-pounders on the plateau answered almost immediately. Their crews had already measured the distance to the road and loaded with solid shot, and the deeper boom of the heavier American guns carried a weight that the British 3-pounders could not match. Round shot plowed into the fields around the British column, bouncing once, twice, and tearing through the undergrowth on the far side of the road. One ball struck a British ammunition cart, splintering the wooden frame and scattering powder barrels across the frozen mud. The artillery duel rolled back and forth for several minutes, neither side able to inflict serious damage from the long range, but each commander learning what the other's guns could do. Cornwallis noted the position of the American cannon on the plateau and marked them as priority targets for his infantry once the assault began. Greene watched the British guns from the third line, his field glass steady despite the round shot that occasionally whistled past his position. The smoke from the American and British cannon mingled over the fields between the two armies, a low gray fog that clung to the ground and made it difficult for the militia behind the fence to see what was coming. Then the British guns fell silent. Through the drifting smoke, the North Carolina militiamen heard the drums change rhythm from the march cadence to the quick step. The first scarlet columns began to form into assault lines on the east side of the field. The scarlet lines stepped off in unison, drum beats propelling the red-coated infantry forward through the frozen stubble of the field. Brigadier General John Butler watched the British approach from behind the rail fence, his North Carolina militiamen kneeling and standing in a long, irregular line. The fence was rough-hewn split logs, chest-high and sturdy enough to steady a musket barrel, but offering no protection against cannon shot. Butler had roughly 1,000 men under his command. Farmers and tradesmen pressed into service with whatever weapon they had carried from home. Some clutched hunting rifles with rifled barrels accurate at 200 yards. Others held old smoothbore muskets, family heirlooms rusted from years hanging above mantelpieces. A few men carried nothing but fowling pieces meant for shooting ducks. They wore homespun coats in shades of brown and gray, broad-brimmed hats pulled low against the morning chill, their breath misting in front of their faces. Thomas Eaton's brigade formed the right wing of the militia line, his men equally raw and equally cold. Many of these North Carolinians had never fired their weapons in combat. Some had never fired them at all. The drums grew louder as the British assault lines crossed the 300-yard mark, the scarlet coats resolving into individual soldiers through the dispersing cannon smoke. Greene had given Butler and Eaton explicit instructions the night before. The militia was to wait until the British closed to 50 yards. Then every man was to fire 2 aimed volleys. After the second volley, they were to fall back in good order toward the second line, where the Virginia militia waited in the woods. Greene had walked the fence line himself, repeating the order to company commanders. 2 volleys and retire. No bayonet fighting. No standing to receive a charge. The British closed to 200 yards, their formation a wall of scarlet, with bayonets fixed and gleaming dully in the gray light. Butler shouted the order to make ready. 1,000 musket hammers clicked backward, the sound carrying down the line like a ripple of snapping twigs. At 100 yards, the British line halted briefly to dress ranks, the sergeants bellowing at the men to close up and level their weapons. Then the drums resumed, and the scarlet wall surged forward again. At 50 yards, Butler gave the command to fire. The first volley erupted along the rail fence in a ragged sheet of flame and white smoke, the sound rolling across the fields like a crack of thunder. Musket balls tore into the British ranks, punching through scarlet wool and the flesh beneath. Men stumbled and fell. The British line staggered but did not stop. The redcoats returned fire, their volley far more disciplined and deadly than the scattered shots from behind the fence. Musket balls shredded the top rail, splintering wood and striking militiamen in the face and chest. Men screamed and collapsed backward, their weapons clattering to the frozen ground. Butler shouted for the second volley. A few hundred militiamen managed to reload with shaking hands, ramming fresh charges down hot barrels and priming the pans with powder from their horns. The second volley was even more ragged than the first, many shots going high into the bare branches overhead. Then Butler gave the order to retire, and the North Carolina line simply dissolved. The militiamen did not withdraw in good order, as Greene had instructed. They ran. Some threw down their muskets and fled straight backward toward the tree line, their broad-brimmed hats flying off as they sprinted through the frozen weeds. Others dropped to their knees and thrust their hands into the air, their faces white with terror. Entire companies broke and scattered, the men pouring through gaps in the rail fence and disappearing into the smoke. The British surged forward with a roar, their bayonets leveled at the fleeing Americans. The brigade of guards led the pursuit, their scarlet coats bright against the brown winter grass. The rail fence splintered under the weight of hundreds of men pushing through, the sound of cracking wood mingling with the shouts of officers trying to maintain order. Tarleton's dragoons spurred their horses forward from the flank, sabers drawn, looking to ride down the fleeing militia before they could reach the safety of the woods. The horsemen thundered across the field, their green-jacketed riders leaning low over their mounts' necks. Dozens of militiamen who had thrown down their weapons were now on their knees with their hands raised. Some of the dragoons ignored the gesture of surrender entirely, slashing downward with their sabers as they galloped past. Other British soldiers bayoneted men who were trying to surrender, the bloodlust of the pursuit overwhelming the discipline of the ranks. Officers screamed at their men to stop, but the chaos of the moment made control nearly impossible. The North Carolina line had been shattered in less than 15 minutes. Bodies lay crumpled along the rail fence and scattered across the field behind it, the wounded groaning and clutching at torn limbs. The British pushed through the wreckage of the first line, their formation now badly disordered by the pursuit. Soldiers who had broken ranks to chase fleeing militiamen were slow to rejoin their units. The 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers and the 33rd Foot advanced through the gap where the fence had been trampled down, but their lines were no longer straight. Men bunched together in some places and spread thin in others, the neat parade ground precision of the morning replaced by the confusion of men who had just sprinted through smoke and gunfire. Cornwallis watched the collapse of the first line from his position near the road, his field glass tracking the scarlet tide as it swept across the abandoned fence. He had expected the militia to break. American militia had broken at Camden, at Savannah, at almost every engagement in the South. But he had not expected his own formations to lose their order so completely in the pursuit. The British were now entering the dense woods where Greene had positioned his second line, and the trees ahead were already filling with the blue-coated figures of Edward Stevens's Virginia militia. The Virginians had watched the North Carolinians flee past their position, running through the trees with terror in their eyes. Stevens shouted at his men to stand firm, his voice carrying through the bare winter branches. The British assault line plunged into the woods, the scarlet coats disappearing into the shadows of the pines and hardwoods. And the second phase of the battle began in a sudden, blinding crash of musket fire from the hidden Virginians. The scarlet lines plunged into the tree line, and the world changed instantly. Sunlight vanished behind a tangle of bare oak and pine branches overhead. Gray smoke from the earlier volleys hung trapped beneath the canopy, turning the woods into a dim, choking maze. Regimental cohesion began to dissolve within the first 30 yards. The 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers drifted left around a thick stand of holly, while the 33rd Foot stumbled right into a ravine hidden by undergrowth. Sergeants shouted themselves hoarse trying to dress ranks, but the trees made it impossible to maintain a continuous line. And from behind every trunk, every fallen log, every thicket of dogwood and scrub pine, the Virginians opened fire. Edward Stevens had positioned his 1,200 men in a loose formation that stretched 300 yards across the wooded slope. Unlike the North Carolinians, the Virginia militia carried their own weapons from home. Long rifles and smoothbore muskets they had used for years hunting deer in the Piedmont forests. They knew how to shoot from cover. A British lieutenant leading a company of the 33rd stepped over a moss-covered log and took a musket ball through his throat before he heard the shot. The Virginians fired from behind trees, ducked back to reload, and fired again from different positions. British soldiers returned fire at muzzle flashes they could barely see through the smoke, their volleys shredding branches and bark, but striking few of the hidden defenders. The noise inside the woods was deafening, a continuous rolling crackle of musketry, punctuated by the shouts of officers and the screams of wounded men. A corporal in the Royal Welch Fusiliers later wrote that he could not see 10 feet in any direction, that the fighting had become 100 private duels between individual soldiers and shadows. The 71st Highlanders pushed forward on the British left, their kilts catching on briars and fallen branches as they struggled through the thickest part of the wood. A Virginia rifleman put a ball through a Highland officer's shoulder at 60 yards, and the man dropped his claymore into the leaf mold. 2 more Highlanders fell trying to drag him back behind a pine. The Guards Battalion, still disordered from the pursuit of the first line, stumbled into a concentrated pocket of Virginia riflemen concealed behind a low stone outcrop. A single volley from the outcrop dropped 7 guardsmen in a heap. The survivors went to ground, firing blindly into the smoke, while their officers crawled between the trees, trying to locate the source of the shooting. Stevens moved constantly along his line, his voice carrying through the din. He had positioned his best marksmen, men from the western Virginia counties who had fought at Point Pleasant and Kings Mountain, in the thickest cover on the flanks. These riflemen targeted British officers with the same deliberate care they used when hunting elk. A captain in the Guards took a ball through the chest while waving his sword to rally his company. A lieutenant colonel of the 33rd fell with a shattered femur, his leg broken so badly that surgeons would amputate it in a farmhouse 2 hours later. The Hessian von Bowes regiment advanced into the center of the woods, their blue coats darkening to near black in the shadows. They moved with the professional discipline of German regulars, firing volleys by platoon and reloading with mechanical precision. But they were firing at ghosts. A volley from the Hessians tore through a cluster of dogwoods and struck nothing but timber. A Virginia company rose from behind a shallow trench they had dug the night before and delivered a close-range volley that staggered the Hessian line. 20 German soldiers dropped in the space of 10 seconds. The Hessians rallied and charged the trench with bayonets, only to find it empty, the Virginians already withdrawn 30 yards deeper into the woods to a fallback position Stevens had marked that morning. This was not a rout. This was a fighting withdrawal conducted by men who had been told exactly where to go and when to go there. Brigadier General Robert Lawson, commanding the 2nd Brigade of Virginia Militia on the right, held his men in a dense thicket of second-growth pine, so thick that British soldiers had to turn sideways to push through the branches. Lawson's men fired 3 volleys into the struggling redcoats before falling back 50 yards to a second position and firing 3 more. The 71st Highlanders attempted a bayonet charge through the pine thicket and lost 40 men before they reached the empty ground where Lawson's brigade had been standing. A Scottish sergeant, his face torn by a splinter from a bullet-struck branch, reportedly told an officer that the devil himself could not drive men out of that wood. The fight in the trees dragged on for nearly an hour. The British had expected the Virginia militia to break as quickly as the North Carolinians had. Instead, Stevens and Lawson were trading them volley for volley, yard for yard, bleeding the Scarlet battalions from positions the British could not see until they were on top of them. The powder smoke grew so thick that men were choking on it, their faces blackened with burnt residue, their eyes stinging and watering. The leaf litter on the forest floor caught fire in half a dozen places from muzzle flashes, small flames licking at the boots of the living and the uniforms of the dead. British casualties climbed alarmingly. The Guards Battalion had lost cohesion entirely. its companies fragmented into isolated clusters of men, fighting separate battles in the underbrush. The 33rd Foot had left their colonel bleeding behind a fallen oak, and were pressing forward under a major who had taken command 3 minutes earlier. The 71st Highlanders, pride of the Scottish regiments, were stalled at the base of a wooded rise, unable to advance into the steady fire coming from the crest. And through it all, Stevens kept his Virginians in the fight. He rode his horse through the smoke with a pistol in one hand and his reins in the other, pointing out new positions, shouting encouragement, and threatening to shoot any man who ran before his ammunition was spent. One Virginia private later recalled seeing the general ride past with a bullet hole through the brim of his hat and blood from a graze on his cheek running down his collar. Stevens did not seem to notice the wound. He was focused entirely on buying Greene the time he needed, bleeding the British advance until it had no strength left for the main line. The Virginians were running low on ammunition. Cartridge boxes that had held 30 rounds that morning now held 5 or 6. Powder horns hung lighter on their straps. Men began calling out to their sergeants, asking for cartridges that did not exist. Stevens gave the order to fall back, and this time the withdrawal was not a flight. Company by company, the Virginians disengaged from their positions and moved uphill through the smoke toward the tree line, where the blue coats of the Continental regulars were visible through the thinning trees. Some units walked backward, facing the enemy, loading and firing their last rounds as they retreated. Lawson's brigade pulled out of the pine thicket on the right, their formation still recognizable as a military unit despite an hour of the most confused fighting any of them had ever experienced. The British pushed through the abandoned positions, stepping over Virginia dead and wounded, their own casualties strewn through a half-mile of scarred and smoking woodland. The redcoats who emerged from the far side of the trees were not the same soldiers who had advanced with such confidence against the rail fence an hour earlier. Their scarlet coats were torn by branches and blackened with powder. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion. Their lines were a wreckage of mixed companies and missing officers. But they were through. The trees thinned, the ground opened into a broad clearing, and there, waiting on the plateau in perfect order, stood Greene's Continentals. The plateau stretched roughly 400 yards across, a broad shelf of open ground with a gentle slope falling away toward the tree line on 3 sides. Greene had positioned his Continentals in a single, unbroken line that ran perpendicular to the New Garden Road. The 1st Maryland Regiment held the right flank, closest to the road, under the command of Colonel John Gunby. Next to them stood the Delaware Light Infantry, fewer than 90 men, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard. The 2nd Maryland occupied the center left, their ranks filled out with replacements recruited during the winter march from the Dan. On the far left, anchoring the line against a wooded draw, stood the 4th Virginia Continentals. 2 brass 6-pounder guns sat between the Maryland regiments, their crews standing ready with rammers and charges. The blue coats of the Continentals were patched and faded, their boots worn through, their faces gaunt from months of short rations. But their lines were dressed with parade ground precision, their bayonets fixed, their cartridge boxes full. They had spent the past hour listening to the crash of musketry in the woods below them, watching the smoke rise through the bare trees, and waiting. Every man on that plateau knew what was coming. The first scarlet coats appeared at the tree line in clusters of 10 and 20, not in the ordered ranks that had crossed the field an hour earlier. The 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers stumbled out of the woods on the British right, their formation reduced to a loose crowd of exhausted men. The 33rd Foot emerged near the center, their colonel bleeding behind a fallen oak in the forest. Their command passed to a major who had been a captain that morning. The 71st Highlanders pushed through on the British left, their kilts torn by brambles, their faces streaked with sweat and powder residue. Hessian soldiers of the von Boes Regiment broke into the open in good order, having fought their way through the far right of the Virginia line with fewer losses. But the heart of the British assault, the Brigade of Guards, came out of the trees in a state that no Guards battalion had been seen in during the entire Southern campaign. Their companies were mixed, their officers reduced by casualties, their scarlet coats indistinguishable from the mud and blood that coated them. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, commanding the Guards, rode out of the trees on a horse flecked with foam and bleeding from a shallow gash across its shoulder. O'Hara was not a man who commanded from the rear. He was visible to his men and to the enemy, gold epaulets on his shoulders, sword drawn, shouting orders to pull the scattered Guards back into something resembling a line of battle. The British advance had been supposed to hit the Continental line in a coordinated wave of 3 columns. Instead, units arrived piecemeal, the Guards first, the Hessians lagging on the right, the Highlanders still disentangling themselves from the pine thicket on the left. Cornwallis, watching from a rise behind the tree line, could see the disaster taking shape. Greene's Continentals were rested, in formation, and waiting. The British assault was arriving exhausted, out of formation and in sections. But O'Hara did not wait for the rest of the army to catch up. He ordered the guards to fix bayonets and prepare to charge the American right. The Guards Battalion, roughly 200 men still on their feet, dressed their line as best they could in the open ground at the edge of the woods. They faced the 1st Maryland and the Delaware Light Infantry, positioned behind a low swell in the plateau that gave the Americans a slight elevation advantage. O'Hara raised his sword and ordered the guards forward. The Scarlet Line began to move uphill at a walk, then at a quick step, their bayonets leveled, their breath coming hard after an hour of fighting in the woods. Gunby watched them come, holding the 1st Maryland steady with orders passed down the line in low voices. He waited until the guards were within 60 yards. Then he gave the command to fire. The volley from the 1st Maryland struck the advancing guards like a scythe. Dozens of redcoats dropped in the first seconds, their advance faltering as men tripped over the bodies of their comrades. The guards returned fire, their volley ragged and high, most of the rounds passing over the heads of the Marylanders. Gunby did not order a second volley. He turned to John Eager Howard, whose Delaware company held the far right of the line, and shouted a single word: "Charge!" Howard repeated the order, and the Delaware Light Infantry lowered their bayonets and surged forward down the gentle slope. The 1st Maryland followed a heartbeat later, 200 men in faded blue coats driving directly at the stunned guards. The distance between the two lines closed in seconds. What happened next was a bayonet fight at close quarters, the kind of combat that professional soldiers trained for and militia could not endure. The sound was not the crack of volleys, but the thud of steel hitting bone, the grunt of men shoving chest to chest, the screams of the wounded underfoot. Howard himself killed a guards officer who lunged at him with a spontoon, parrying the thrust and driving his own sword through the man's chest. A Delaware sergeant named Peter Jacquet bayoneted 2 guardsmen in succession, then turned to find a third and drove him backward into his own collapsing line. The 1st Maryland crashed into the guards from the front, while the Delaware Company, smaller and faster, worked around the British right flank. The guards began to give ground. It started with a few men stepping backward to avoid the American bayonets. Then a cluster of guardsmen, their ammunition spent and their officers dead, simply stopped fighting and fled toward the tree line. Within 3 minutes of the Marylanders making contact, the entire Guards Battalion was in retreat. O'Hara, still on horseback, tried to rally his men, riding directly into the path of the fleeing soldiers and shouting at them to turn and fight. A musket ball struck him in the chest, and he swayed in the saddle. Another round hit his horse, which collapsed beneath him, pinning the general to the ground. With O'Hara down and the guards in full flight, the entire British right flank collapsed. The 23rd Fusiliers, emerging from the woods behind the guards, found themselves facing a wave of American bayonets with no support on either side. They began to waver. Cornwallis, watching through a spyglass from his position on the rise, could see his entire line dissolving from right to left. The guards were running. The Fusiliers were falling back. The 33rd Foot was still struggling to form up in the clearing, and now faced a counterattack without a flank to anchor on. For several minutes, the British army at Guilford Courthouse was closer to destruction than it had been in any engagement since the war began. On the American left, the 2nd Maryland and the 4th Virginia Continentals advanced to meet the remnants of the 71st Highlanders and the Hessian von Bowes Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Ford, commanding the 2nd Maryland, the two lines traded rounds at a range of 40 yards, the Highlanders firing individually, the Marylanders firing by platoon in rolling volleys that never paused. The 4th Virginia, under Major Alexander Stewart, moved into a gap between the 2nd Maryland and the woods and opened fire on the Hessians before they could fully emerge from the tree line. The Hessian advance stalled. Everywhere Cornwallis looked, his army was losing. And then, from the center of the plateau, a voice rose above the gunfire. Cornwallis stood on the rise beside his 6-pounder, watching his right flank collapse through a spyglass. The guards were running. His entire line was dissolving from right to left in the space of minutes. He turned to the young artillery officer commanding the brass 6-pounder at his side. The officer was Lieutenant John MacLeod, a Scotsman who had served under Cornwallis since the siege of Charleston. Cornwallis pointed toward the melee and gave the order, "Load with grape." MacLeod stared at the general for a heartbeat. The gun was loaded with round shot, still aimed at the plateau where the American third line had stood. Between the muzzle and that position, British guardsmen were locked in hand-to-hand combat with Marylanders. British soldiers were dying under American bayonets not 40 yards from the gun. MacLeod did not argue. A lieutenant did not argue with a lieutenant general on a collapsing battlefield. He ordered his gun crew to sponge out the round shot and reload. A gunner rammed the wet sponge down the barrel to extinguish any lingering sparks. Another man lifted a canvas bag of grape shot from the limber chest. Grape shot consisted of iron balls roughly 1.5 inches in diameter packed into a cloth cylinder. When fired, the bag disintegrated, and the ball spread outward in a cone of metal. At close range, it functioned less like a cannon and more like an enormous shotgun. The crew rammed the grape shot home, then primed the touch hole with powder. McLeod sighted the piece himself. He aimed directly into the thickest cluster of struggling men, redcoats and bluecoats tangled together on the slope below. Then he touched the slow match to the vent. The 6-pounder roared and bucked backward. The iron balls tore through the mass of troops at a range of less than 50 yards. Dozens of men dropped instantly. British guardsmen and American Marylanders fell together, struck by the same blast. Musket balls could be aimed or deflected. Grape shot at that distance erased whatever stood in its path. Sergeant Jacquet of the Delaware Light Infantry, who had just bayoneted his 3rd guardsman, was blown sideways by the concussion. He survived. The guardsman he had been driving backward did not. The Maryland advance, which had been surging forward with unstoppable momentum seconds earlier, came apart. Men who had been shouting and driving with bayonets now stumbled through smoke and screaming. Some dropped their weapons from the sheer shock of the blast. Others stared at the bodies on the ground, British and American lying in the same tangle of broken limbs. The American counterattack stopped cold. Gunby's 1st Maryland, which had shattered the guards and was pursuing them toward the tree line, halted its advance. The Delaware Company, which had been working around the British right flank, recoiled as the grape shot ripped through the edge of their formation. A strange silence fell across that section of the field for perhaps 10 seconds. Men on both sides were trying to understand what had just happened. Then the British began to rally. The surviving guardsmen, released from the pressure of the American bayonets, reformed their line with the speed of professional soldiers trained to recover from catastrophe. A guards officer, whose name never appeared in the official dispatches, seized the moment and shouted for his men to dress ranks. The 23rd Fusiliers, wavering on the edge of flight seconds earlier, steadied as the American assault in front of them collapsed. British sergeants pushed men back into line, shoving the terrified and the wounded alike into something resembling a formation. On the American right, the momentum that had carried the 1st Maryland and the Delaware troops forward was gone. Howard looked at the bodies on the ground and understood exactly what Cornwallis had done. He could see British dead among the grape shot casualties, their scarlet coats riddled with the same iron balls that had killed his own men. Cornwallis had fired on his own soldiers to prevent a rout. The decision was monstrous, and it had worked. Greene watched from his position on the plateau as his counterattack shattered. He had seen the flash of the 6-pounder, watched his Marylanders and the Delaware troops reel backward, understood that the moment of victory had passed. He had one chance to destroy the British army, and Cornwallis had taken it from him with a single order. Now the British were rallying, and his Continentals stood exposed. Greene made his decision without hesitation. He turned to his aides and issued the order to withdraw. The Continental regulars were the only force he could not afford to lose. Militia could be recalled and reformed. The Continental regiments were years in the making and could not be replaced. If Cornwallis's rallied troops counterattacked now, the Marylanders and the Delaware Company would be cut off and destroyed. The 2nd Maryland and the 4th Virginia, still engaged with the Highlanders and Hessians on the left, would be flanked. Greene ordered the entire 3rd line to disengage and retire in good order. The order passed down the line through mounted messengers. Lieutenant Colonel Howard received it while still on horseback amid the wreckage of the counterattack. He began pulling his Delaware Company back toward the main road. Gunby's 1st Maryland followed, their withdrawal covered by the 2 6-pounders on the plateau. The American gunners fired a final salvo of round shot over the heads of the retiring infantry. The shots passed high, but bought enough time for the regiments to reform on the reverse slope. On the left, Lieutenant Colonel Ford received the withdrawal order and began pulling the 2nd Maryland back by sections. The regiment had been trading fire with the 71st Highlanders for nearly 20 minutes. They broke contact with the same rolling platoon volleys they had used during the advance. One company firing while another fell back. The Highlanders, exhausted and badly bloodied, did not pursue. Major Stewart's 4th Virginia pulled out of their position against the Hessians and filed onto the New Garden Road behind the Marylanders. The entire Continental line contracted into a column and began moving south along the road. Cornwallis watched the Americans withdraw, but did not order a pursuit. He had no cavalry fresh enough to follow. Tarleton's dragoons were scattered across the battlefield, some still tangled in the woods, others collecting prisoners from the broken militia line. The British infantry, even the rallied guards, were too exhausted to move faster than a walk. Cornwallis had held the field. His army was too shattered to chase the men who had abandoned it. Greene's Continentals marched away in good order, leaving behind their 2 6-pounders, their dead, and a field carpeted with bodies in red and blue. The sun set over the Guilford Courthouse battlefield. Bodies covered the ground for nearly a mile along the New Garden Road. British burial parties worked through the night. They dug mass graves in the frozen soil. The final casualty count staggered every officer who read it. 93 British soldiers lay dead on the field. 413 more carried wounds ranging from shattered limbs to musket balls lodged deep in chest and gut tissue. 26 men were simply missing, their bodies never recovered from the dense woods where the Virginia militia had fought. The arithmetic was brutal. Cornwallis had marched roughly 1,900 men into battle that morning. 532 of them were now dead or wounded, 28% of his entire force. No army could absorb losses of that magnitude and remain an effective fighting force. The Brigade of Guards suffered worst of all. 11 Guards officers fell during the bayonet fight with the Marylanders and the grape shot salvo that followed. 200 Guardsmen were killed or wounded. The elite infantry unit of the British Army had been hollowed out in a single afternoon. The 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers lost entire companies. The 33rd Foot still had officers lying in the woods with shattered femurs awaiting field amputation. The 71st Highlanders counted their dead and found gaps in every platoon. The Hessian von Bo's regiment reported casualties that left their formation too thin to hold a line without reinforcement. Cornwallis wrote his dispatch to London the following day. He described a complete victory over the rebel forces. He praised the courage of his officers. He omitted the rout of the Guards. He omitted the fact that his army could not march another mile in pursuit. The dispatch reached London weeks later. British newspapers printed triumphant headlines. The public believed Cornwallis had crushed the American army in the South. They would not learn the truth until the war was already lost. Cornwallis knew what the newspapers did not. His army was crippled. He could not hold the Carolinas with units this depleted. He could not catch Greene, whose Continentals had marched away intact. He could not feed his men without supply lines that Greene's partisans kept cutting. Within days of the battle, Cornwallis gave the order to abandon the Carolina interior. He marched his wounded, limping army east toward the coast. They reached Wilmington, North Carolina, where the Royal Navy could resupply them by sea. But Wilmington was not a position from which to conquer the South. It was a refuge for a beaten army catching its breath. Cornwallis made a fateful decision in Wilmington. Rather than return to the interior and resume the grinding campaign against Greene, he marched north into Virginia. He believed a decisive victory there could still salvage the war. 7 months later, American and French forces trapped Cornwallis at a small tobacco port called Yorktown. The general who had fired grape shot into his own men to win at Guilford Courthouse surrendered his entire army there. The road to Yorktown began on the blood-soaked field in North Carolina. Greene's army had retreated in good order. That was the difference. The Continentals had lost 78 men killed and 183 wounded. These were real losses. Every name on the casualty list belonged to a soldier Greene could not easily replace. But the Maryland regiments were intact. The Delaware Company still had its officers. The 4th Virginia could fight again. The militia losses on paper looked catastrophic. 1,046 men missing. But most of those missing men were North Carolina militiamen who had fled after firing their 2 volleys, kept running through the woods, and eventually returned to their farms. They were not dead. They were not prisoners. They had simply gone home. And they could be recalled when the next campaign began. The militia system that looked broken on March 15th was actually working exactly as Greene had calculated. Citizen soldiers had not been asked to stand against British bayonets and die. They had been asked to fire, withdraw, and live to fight another season. The real tragedy lay in the field between the armies. American wounded lay where they had fallen for hours after the guns went silent. The British had too many of their own casualties to tend to the enemy. Men with shattered legs and stomach wounds lay in the cold mud while the sun tracked across the sky. Some were found by British burial parties and carried to field hospitals. Others lay there through the night, their cries fading as shock and blood loss did their work. The rough treatment of surrendering militia added another layer of bitterness to the aftermath. Enraged British troops who had watched their comrades fall in the woods and their Guards battalion routed on the plateau had bayoneted men attempting to surrender. Some militiamen threw down their weapons and raised their hands. They were cut down before officers could intervene. The rage was not policy, but it was real. Word spread through the Carolina backcountry. The stories of what happened to prisoners at Guilford Courthouse hardened the resolve of communities that might otherwise have stayed out of the war. Cornwallis had won the field. He had lost the South. The campaign that was supposed to crush the rebellion below Virginia had consumed his army instead. Greene wrote his own dispatch to Congress in the days after the battle. He did not claim victory. He reported that he had withdrawn in good order, that his Continentals had proven they could break the British line, and that the Southern Army remained intact and ready to fight. Congress understood what the British public did not. Nathanael Greene had lost a battle and won a war. 4 months after Guilford Courthouse, British forces controlled only the ground their soldiers physically stood on in the Carolinas. Every garrison they left behind was isolated. Every supply line was cut. Every loyalist who had bet on the crown began to reconsider. One British officer wrote afterward that another such victory would ruin the British army. He was correct. There would be no more such victories. The war in the South was effectively over.